This is by no means a representative scale, but there are 7 vertebrae, which is represented by the marshmallows in the cervical spine. There are 12 in the thoracic and 5 in the lumbar. This is for the average person. Sometimes there is an extra vertebrae in there, or sometimes there's less, but for the sake of this video, we're talking about the average person. This is your cervical spine, which is in lordosis. This is your thoracic spine, which is in kyphosis. And this is your lumbar segment, which is in lordosis. So the vertebrae, the marshmallowy part of the cervical spine, they're tiny. So they're not as thick as the ones in the thoracic spine, even though that's not portrayed here. So they're tiny, they're oblong. I'm going to take one of these segments. So this is your C1 at the very top. This is your transverse process. There's one on each side, and they're attached to your vertebrae. This does not have a spinous process, which is located on your other vertebrae. So this middle guy is your spinous process, and it's that bony part that you can feel when you touch the back of your neck or the back of your upper back, any of that. So that part that sticks out, that's your spinous process. Let's talk about what each segment of the spine can do and why. So your cervical spine, it can flex, it can extend, and it also can rotate left and right. And also laterally flex. The reason why the cervical spine can do all of those movements, oh, this is a mess, is because the spinous process and the transverse process don't get in the way of each other. So they relatively stick straight out. There's some other things happening in there. Like I said, this isn't perfect, but to give you an idea of what is happening, that is what's happening down there. And now we're going to talk about our thoracic spine. In the thoracic spine, our vertebrae are heart-shaped. So our thoracic spine looks a lot different. You can see that we have our spinous processes facing down, which doesn't allow for a lot of extension. So I'm going to take these first 2 vertebrae here, and me as a yogi, I'm going to try to back bend, and oh no, my spinous processes, which are bones by the way, boom, run into each other. I cannot find extension in my thoracic spine. There's about 0 to 5 degrees of movement depending on who you are. But for the sake of this, let's just say there's no movement. So that's what happens when we try to do back bends or standing back bends, is that this is why there's barely any movement, is because our spinous processes run into each other. So there's a bunch of discs between each of these vertebrae, and typically when you herniate something, it's because it's popping out the anterior side or the posterior side of the spine, depending on what you're trying to achieve. What is a disc? Let's put our vertebrae back in place. A disc, it goes between each of the vertebrae. I'm going to compare it to this little piece of oatmeal. When it's dry, it's kind of crackly. It has that crackly texture. When it has movement and it's feeling free and yummy, it'll poof up like your oatmeal does when you add water and warm it up. I know oatmeal's a bad example, but hey, that's what we got to work with. Most of our extension and back bends comes from our cervical and our lumbar spine. In our thoracic spine, we can flex, we can barely extend. And you can see why we can flex is because there's a lot of movement there. We can kind of rotate, but there's a lot of tension in these areas. We also have ribs, so unless you're moving one of your ribs and not the rest of them, it's kind of hard for these to move as a unit. So most of the rotation comes from the lower part of the thoracic or the upper. So most of your movement isn't going to come where your ribs directly are. We can also laterally move the thoracic spine as well. Feels really nice. In our lumbar spine, our discs are kidney shaped, and they are dense and thick for weight bearing. So we only have 5 of them. They're the thickest discs, but also the area that we tend to see impingement, and by impingement I mean herniating discs down here. So our lumbar spine, there's our coccyx coming off down here, and our lumbar spine is connected to our pelvis, or in a way that's where it's leading to. So when we walk, a lot of our weight is coming right up into this area, so this has to disperse the load. There's big discs between as well. Our lumbar spine can flex and extend as well, but because these discs are so close together, you're not going to find a lot of rotation in our lumbar spine, or if anything, we're trying to prevent it. We want most of our rotation to come from mostly this area. So when we are doing back bends, there's barely any room down here, as you can see, between the spinous process and the transverse process. So when we try to move into extension, we're compressing a lot of these discs down here. It's not to say that it's wrong, but when you are moving into a back bend without strength on this front end of your body, you're going to start compressing the muscles back here, and without support from the front, you're not going to get a lot of support from the back, and then all of these discs are going to smoosh together, especially if you're in an anterior tilt. These are already smushed together.